Hello again, YouTube. My name is New, and we are finally back with another video. Now, this video is going to be a little bit different from my previous ones because in previous videos I was looking at, what are these arguments that I either agree or disagree with? Why are they not well made? This time around, we have an argument that I think is, for the most part, well made. I think it has its flaws later on, but I think it's very well structured to begin with. And it provides a lot of useful insight into how we can go about structuring our own arguments and forming our own ideas. It's also a really interesting video to look at because I think at their core, this video and the last video with Rick talking about the Grammys and why he doesn't like modern music are fundamentally getting to the same idea and just presenting it in two very different ways. And we'll kind of get into that later, but first, let me give you some context. So this video is from Brandon Sanderson. He is a major science fiction and fantasy author. He's giving a speech at his convention to a large audience of his fans, of course, and he's talking about exploring his feelings on AI art and whether or not it is art, right? So we'll go ahead and get started here, look at sort of how he starts to form his arguments.
In April 2010, film critic Roger Ebert, he made an infamous claim. He said, video games can never be art. Yeah, I know. His blog post set off this firestorm of discussion. I was there back then on the internet. I'm old, and everyone was talking about it, talking about kind of how he's an out-of-touch old man yelling at clouds.
Right. So, we're going to start this argument with this cover frame story of Roger Ebert making this bold claim about video games not being art. And the reason Brandon does this is because he is worried that he is doing the same thing when it comes to AI, right? So he's having this moment of, I don't like this new thing. Hold on a second. Oh no. Am I the old man yelling at clouds, right? Am I wrong? And he goes through and he lists out, here's the history of major changes where like new mediums were being created, right? Photography and film and music and video games, right? How they have shifted over time, and people in the time rebelled against them and said, no, that is not art. And so he has to come at this saying, ooh, you know what? I think I feel the same way about AI. Am I in the wrong? And what's really great about approaching things this way is it gives us a lot of opportunity to actually build up why we are right by trying to prove ourselves wrong, right? So we're going to skip a little ahead and talk about what he's fully talking about here, right here.
I've ever been, right? Because my goal is to talk about what is art and why we make it.
Right. So, am I wrong? Well, in order to figure out whether or not I'm wrong, let's ask some questions to kind of help guide that discussion. So those questions are going to be, what is art and why we make it? Now, in previous videos, I've kind of harped on people for not defining terms, right? We're going to be talking about things and we're not going to have a clear understanding. This is a fun way to get around that, sort of, because what we're doing here is the process of constructing our argument is how we are going to define our terms, right? We're going to define art as we explore what is art, right? And then, also the question of why do we make it? That's not quite something we're defining. I mean, I guess it is something we're defining. It's a question that we are seeking to answer as we try and form our arguments, right? So we're going to skip a little further ahead and get some more reasoning from Brandon on what he's doing and why he's laying it out the way he is.
A relevant way, I want to dig into my own feelings on this topic from a philosophical standpoint, right? The surge of large language models and generative AI raises questions that are fascinating. And even if I dislike how the movement is going in relating to writing and art, I want to learn from the experience of what's happening. We're being forced to ask ourselves about art in a way we never have before. Now, some do say we're in an AI bubble, perhaps a collapse is coming, but even if it does come, I think what has happened so far is enough to force us to confront these questions of what is art, why do we make it? Now, I explore my ideas through writing, and so I ask you to join me for, these next 20 minutes or so as I explore this idea, and in so doing, help me figure out why I, Brandon Sanderson, rebel so strongly against the idea of AI art. And it was in writing this essay that I kind of figured it out.
Right, so this is a really important point of this whole thing that kind of made me want to make this video in the first place. Brandon comes into this with this feeling, right? I think that's the best way to call it. He feels strongly that AI art is not art. It shouldn't count as that. But he's going to take a step back from that, have some humility, and say, I could be wrong. Let's explore how I could be wrong about that, right? And so then in the process of doing that, he writes this essay, and going through exploring how he could be wrong, writing his essay, is how he forms a strong idea, how he forms the core of his argument for why he believes what he believes. This is a great thing we should all kind of be doing. Whenever we feel a certain way about something, we should be approaching it from this standpoint of, how am I wrong? What ways could I be wrong? Am I just wrong? And from that is how we can strengthen what we believe and start to build arguments for why we believe them. A good example of this that I can think of in my own life, I work in engineering. I often have to deal with comments from plan reviewers, right? And I go into every new set of comments with the same general standpoint of, I want to do exactly 0 of these comments, make 0 changes to my plans if I can help it. So every time I get a comment, I start from the position of, no, I'm not doing that. And then, because realistically, I'm wrong most of the time, I step back and say, okay, I don't want to do this, but why do I actually have to? Let's try and construct the argument from the other side, right? And so I'll go through and I'll look at what they're saying and kind of argue, well, okay, it really doesn't change anything, and it's more a headache than it's worth to tell them no, so I'll just tell them yes on this one, or on this one, they got me. That is a good change. I do need to change that out. But then sometimes they're out of line. I have someone who has expertise and should only be reviewing utilities, and they're telling me how to design something completely different, unrelated to utilities, and someone else who does have jurisdiction over that told me, no, you're building it this way, and they're saying, no, I want it this way. No, I can tell them no, right? But I always have to approach it from, I want to say no, but I'm probably wrong, because 90% of the time I am wrong. That's just a really great way to approach any sort of belief you have. Question why you were wrong, not try and prove yourself right. And I think that's a very big difference from what Rick was doing, right? Because it very much feels like in Rick's video, he sits there and he says, ew, this music is bad. Let me try and find out some reasons that it's bad so I can point to those and say that, right? That's why we get these really flimsy feeling reasons of, oh, well, it had a lot of writers on it. Oh, it uses a lot of sampling, right? It's because he was looking for ways to confirm what he believed, not trying to pick apart the ways where what he believed could be wrong. So, we'll skip ahead a little bit here again and talk about some more of what Brandon is saying.
Let me examine a few common objections. I want to start there, right? Do I dislike AI because of the economic and environmental impacts? Well, they do concern me. But if I'm answering honestly, I would still have a problem with it, even if AI were not so resource hungry, right? Do I dislike it because the model's been trained on the works of artists in ways I consider unethical? Well, I don't like that. But even if it were trained using no copyrighted work, I'd still be concerned, right? I think we all would be. They're valid objections, but they don't get to the soul of it for me. Maybe I just hate the idea of a machine replacing a person. For a while, I've imagined that if we needed a heroic symbol of resistance against AI art, we actually have the perfect choice in American folklore. It's John Henry.
Right, so he starts to kind of peel back the layers of some common arguments that get made of why people don't want AI art, right? Because this is an ongoing discussion within the community that he's a part of. That's actually something I've kind of failed at talking about in previous videos that I do need to do better about, is addressing like audience and stuff and whatever ongoing discourse might be existing. There's a lot of context to every argument, and I've kind of tangentially touched on it when talking about other things. I think in my first video I kind of got to this idea, just not directly, but it is something to acknowledge that this is an ongoing discussion. There are a lot of well-formed ideas already that many people who are familiar with the subject matter are going to be familiar with, and maybe we don't need to express as much about them because everyone just understands them to begin with. But he's going to pick apart some of these arguments that currently exist that people provide for why they are against AI and say, look, yes, those are problems, but those don't get to the problem, right? We can solve those problems, and I still have a problem. And that's a really good part of this whole exploration of approaching, well, how can I be wrong? How can I be wrong? Well, I could be sitting here saying that the reason why I'm against it is because it's resource hungry or because it's using stolen data. Well, if I solve those problems, then I no longer should have a problem with it. So if that's what I base my argument on is, oh, well, it's resource hungry, oh, it's using stolen data, then once those problems do get solved, I no longer get to have a problem with the AI, right? And maybe for some people that's fine, but for Brandon, he says, no, that doesn't feel right. And he keeps digging, and that's where he gets to this John Henry comparison, right? What he's going to talk about there is how, you know, John Henry, famous folktale, American folktale, of a steel driver who competes against a steam engine, right? And he does this big competition, just barely manages to beat the steam engine with the power of just human spirit, right? And then he falls over dead. And in the end, the steam engine basically wins, because sure, the human spirit was stronger than it this one time, but then it caused him to fall over dead, so that's exactly why we need the steam engine, right? And an important distinction that will be made here is that what is going on with John Henry versus the steam engine is not the same as what is going on with an artist versus AI necessarily, because those are things we should just, as Brandon said, those are things we should just want replaced, human labor replaced in, right? We don't want people running around dying of exertion trying to dig tunnels. If we have a tool that can just dig the tunnel for us, that's probably better for us in the long run, because the tunnel is a product. And we're going to skip ahead a little bit again and talk about something else related to products. So here we go.
Written. It ends with these lines. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. All art is quite useless. Now, of course...
Right. So, this is a quote from Oscar Wilde. He gives a little more context on it. But it's talking about art as a product. Well, normally we would think of products as being something useful. But, and there are arguments you can make against this claim. Oscar Wilde is saying art does not have a direct use, right? Therefore, it's not really a product in the same way as, say, a tunnel, right? And this is where we're going to get to sort of what Brandon determines is his actual argument against AI. So we'll skip ahead a little bit.
Point. The most important thing to understand is that The process of creating art makes art of you. My friends, let me repeat that. The book, the painting, the film script is not the only art. It's important, but in a way it's a receipt. It's a diploma. The book you write, the painting you create, the music you compose is important and artistic, but it's also a mark of proof that you have done the work to learn, because in the end of it all, you are the art.
Right. So, a piece of artwork is only part of the product, if you want to look at it that way. And that's really the crux of the argument that Brandon arrives at by peeling back all these layers and doing this exploration of how can I be wrong is, aha, the reason I am not wrong in disagreeing with AI is because what art is a process whereby you create something, and in creating, that changes you as well. And that's, like I said, a very similar argument, I think, to what Rick was ultimately trying to get at, but just couldn't articulate through what he was saying. Because he was talking about how music these days is so awful and blah, 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 and look how many people it takes to make it, and look at how they're just reusing old stuff. If we start to dig down into, like, what seems to be the central theme of this, it is, again, that it's not this creative process by an individual or by a few people to make something that changes them, right? But Rick explained that so poorly that I have to sit here and say, oh, I disagree with your arguments, whereas Brandon has gotten to it through a process that I agree with, and so, I sit here and go, yes, I like what Brandon is saying. Now, I will go ahead and note that from this point in his speech, he's going to make some assertions and stuff, and those assertions I don't really agree with necessarily, or I don't think he has put enough thought into yet, and that brings up an interesting point as well. So one of those assertions that he's going to make is that, the reason why it is art when we do it but not when a machine does it is because when we make the art, it changes us. But when you prompt a machine to put out an output, it doesn't change the machine, which, if my understanding of the technology is correct, is actually not true. The process of prompting a large language model should enact some change on it based off of, like, once it outputs the results and you say something about those results, that in turn is used as further training data for the model, if my understanding is correct, right? And so just at its face value, the claim that the process of creating something doesn't change the machine is wrong. What we have to do, if we want to make an argument like this, is, again, start peeling back the layers and ultimately arrive at something like, well, sure, the machine is changing, but it's not changing in the same way that people change, because fundamentally the amount of information going into the machine is and the type of information going into the machine that changes it isn't the same as what happens with people, right? To kind of make this example a little more obvious, if you took a passage of Shakespeare and fed it into the large language model, it would only get the training data of whatever text was contained within Shakespeare, and then whatever tags you associate with Shakespeare, right? Because that's part of how it works, is my understanding. Meanwhile, a kid reading Shakespeare in their 9th grade English class is not just getting the text of Shakespeare, they're getting the feel of the book that Shakespeare is written in. They're getting all the sounds and smells and sights of their classroom environment. There are people all around them that they have connections to and friendships or whatever other relationships with. They have a history that they are drawing from of experiences as they approach this work, where, and that could be anything from they just got out of lunch and so they're feeling a little tired, to, this morning such and such happened and it made their day better or worse, and so that changes the emotions they are feeling as they interact with the work. Or they read a certain word in Shakespeare and it reminds them of this time when they were 5 or something like that, right? There is so much more information and connection going on in the human than is going on in the machine. And so for now, we say that these are two different processes until such a time that the machine can have all that, at which point, now we have a different question, which is, do we have a machine anymore, or do we have another sapient existence, right? So these are all kind of ways we can dig down into that argument some more. And this is all, I'm making this point because this helps kind of prove what Brandon is saying to be true in a way. Because Brandon is writing this at this specific point in his life. And this conversation is going to be ongoing, right? He's going to probably keep thinking about AI and art and what it means to make art and why he creates art. This is just what he's arrived at for now. 2 years down the line, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, he might review this essay and disagree with some of the things he says, or have new ways to state his ideas, and he would write something completely different. And in doing so would again change, because he is transient, and his art is just a reflection on one state that he exists in that transience. And then he will continue to change in the future, and he will make something new based off of that change. And that kind of proves his point, right? So that's really all there is to say about this video for now. I hope that you have gotten something useful out of this, and I hope you can see the connection again with what we were talking about in our previous video. If you like kind of this more trying to construct an argument, like starting from I feel this, why am I wrong, what can I be right about, I have currently an idea for maybe my own video essay that I want to put together in the future, so let me know down in the comments if you would like to see that, or if you want to keep seeing videos kind of just discussing like how we form arguments and stuff like that. It gets a little hard to make those from time to time because I feel like I end up repeating myself a bunch, but let me know what you think, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Have a good one.